All right. I'm Steve Milloy. It's great to be here. This is my second presentation of the day. There are two things that are important to me in my professional line of work, science reality and making it stick. And I'm concerned that that's not happening. I was a member of the EPA transition team for the first Trump administration, and I was in charge of writing the plan for fixing science at EPA. And so I did a comprehensive plan, and a lot of it was done. But then as soon as Biden became president, it became undone. And so I don't want that to happen again. I want things to stick. It's very important that they stick. Because if they don't stick, then as soon as there is the next Democrat president, which could happen in a couple years, we're going to be right back to where we were with Obama and Biden. And so at this point, we have about 33 months left to go. And this panel is about major upcoming battles. I'm going to tell you what I think they are from my perspective, which is science and making it stick. Science realism, making it stick. So the first thing I want to talk about is Massachusetts versus EPA. Now, the endangerment finding was issued by the Obama administration in 2009. It's the key federal finding underlying all of federal climate activity. And it is that emissions of greenhouse gases threaten public health and welfare. And so, it's fantastic that the Trump administration has now rescinded the endangerment finding that the Obama administration issued, but that's not enough. And kudos go to Lee Zeldin for doing this. This morning, Craig Rucker described Zeldin as the greatest EPA administrator ever, and that is certainly true. But I'm also going to tell you that that's a pretty low bar. Okay? I mean, we've had many Democrat EPA administrators, and they've been awful. We've had Republican administrators who have been awful. The best Republican administrators have been only okay in that they did not advance the regulatory agenda too much. Now, when it comes to the endangerment finding, the key issue is the Supreme Court case in 2007, Massachusetts versus EPA. This case was wrongly decided. It was as wrongly decided as Roe versus Wade, just making things up. The key finding was that the Clean Air Act, which provides EPA with its authority to regulate air quality, air pollution, air pollutants, does not mention greenhouse gases at all, as far as EPA regulation of them. And so through hook and crook, I don't want to go through the whole process, but the Clinton administration basically set up the Bush administration to fall into the trap of Massachusetts versus EPA winding up at the Supreme Court. And this case came up right after Al Gore's movie came out, and there was climate hysteria. 2007, that's about the time of the first Heartland climate conference. And the court ruled that EPA could, not that it had to, but could regulate greenhouse gases. Okay. And of course, when the Obama administration came to town, that's what they did. and they were so organized, they had their minds made up before Inauguration Day what they were going to do, and within 9 months, they timed their announcement for the endangerment finding for the Copenhagen conference in 2009. And so since then, they've been regulating greenhouse gases and issuing other endangerment findings for stationary sources and such. And so, and groups like Heartland, CO2 Coalition, Competitive Enterprise Institute over the years and others have petitioned EPA to rescind the endangerment finding based on science, and EPA never did anything about it. Even in Trump 1, they did not dare propose to rescind the endangerment finding. So, of course, President Trump ordered it done by executive order very early. Fantastic. And Zeldin got around to doing it in February. Now, President Trump only has 33 months to go, and this is very important. So the finding was recently rescinded. The environmentalists sued about a week later, and so there's going to be a case heard now in the DC Circuit, and maybe it'll get to the Supreme Court. I'm personally surprised that the environmentalists filed this lawsuit, because the smartest thing for them, I think, would have been just to let EPA rescind the endangerment finding, so that when Democrats, they obviously are going to be very positive about thinking Democrats can be elected in 2028, so that when we get a Democrat administration, they don't have to worry about getting Congress to do anything on climate, because they'll just reissue the endangerment finding and we could just go back to where we were. So there's this ongoing litigation now, and it's really a race against time. And we have wasted time. President Trump in April, last April, issued an executive order saying that rules, regulations that were made illegal by Supreme Court decisions, they could be summarily eliminated without public comment. At the time when I saw that, I thought, wow, that's great, because that's what's going to happen to the endangerment finding. If you went to lunch, you heard Patrick Morrissey talk about West Virginia versus EPA, where EPA needs express congressional authorization to undertake major regulatory programs. And of course, climate is a major regulatory program. And so it's quite obvious that West Virginia versus EPA, in effect, overturns Massachusetts versus EPA. Now, the reason it's not explicitly like that is because, when the red states, led by Patrick, sued, none of them asked for that. None of them asked for Massachusetts versus EPA to be overturned. And with the conservative Supreme Court, if you don't ask for it, they're not going to do it on their own. So you have to ask for it. And if EPA had just deleted the endangerment finding last spring, the environmentalists probably would have sued, but the case would have quickly made it to the Supreme Court on the issue of whether the Trump administration could delete an illegal regulation, and the issue would be is the endangerment finding illegal under West Virginia versus EPA? And we could have hashed it out. But that didn't happen. We had this abortive effort at the Climate Working Group over the summer. That gave time for the National Academy of Sciences to get involved and do their work. And then shortly there was a lawsuit about that report. And things have just really gotten messed up. And I want to get this fixed. We can fix this now. So the green strategy here is to run out the clock, to drag out the litigation, and hope for regime change, starting with the midterms, and make things chaotic and unknowable. And if there's anything we've learned from today's world, you cannot predict what's going to happen tomorrow, and it could have significant impacts. I don't think the world used to be this way, or at least it wasn't during the 90s and 2000s, but it is now. We just don't know what's going to happen. And so we need to get these things done. And so it's very important that we get this endangerment finding case out of the DC Circuit to the Supreme Court so that they can overturn Massachusetts versus EPA. It is not enough for the Supreme Court to rule that the Trump administration could rescind the endangerment finding. And the reason for that is because when we get a Democrat administration, they'll just reissue it. We need to get it to the point where this Massachusetts versus EPA case is no longer considered good law. It either needs to be explicitly overturned, or there must be some workaround where it's just not good law and no one can rely on it anymore. Because we can't stop Congress from considering climate because of the nature of our government, but that's fine. Let the environmentalists try to get climate through Congress. Okay, that'll be a very difficult task, and that's where we need to go. So, and towards this end, groups like the CO2 Coalition, Competitive Enterprise Institute, Texas Public Policy Foundation, I think Pacific Legal Foundation as well, maybe, are intervening in the case, in the litigation, the endangerment finding litigation, as parties. And as parties, they hope to be able to steer the litigation. You know, if you just leave the litigation to red states, well, you're going to get the kind of result in West Virginia versus EPA where they forgot to ask to overturn Massachusetts versus EPA. Okay, and that was a major mistake. If you just leave it to the Trump administration and the Department of Justice lawyers, well, we've all seen what kind of lawyering they have. It's not very good. It's not consistent. It's not very good. I don't know what will happen. So we have think tanks have gotten, you know, good lawyers, and I hope that, you know, we can shape the litigation that way. So this is a very important battle. We need to get this done. We need to get it done while President Trump is in office, and we must get rid of Massachusetts versus EPA. Okay, the next thing is science. And this is not climate science per se. I'm just talking about all of the science that EPA does. And this actually does have kind of a link to the climate working group that DOE tried to put together. So I started working on these issues in 1990. I worked for a regulatory lobbyist. He hired me because I was a lawyer and a statistician, and there was this whole burgeoning field of EPA risk assessment. So I got involved in that. And I did that for a while, and then eventually I got a contract from the Department of Energy because they were being persecuted by EPA on nuclear waste and nuclear cleanup. And the Department of Energy wanted a report showing how, you know, when EPA risk management decisions are based on politics, not science. So, you know, the good news was EPA doesn't use science. EPA uses what we call science policy. And science policy, as an example, and we'll talk about this a little later, the linear no threshold model for cancer risk assessment. I've got graphs to show you. And it's basically where, you know, because people who are exposed to radiation, they have a, you know, higher risk of cancer at very high doses. And we don't have any data showing that they get cancer or have an increased cancer risk at lower doses. EPA just draws a line from where people have an increased risk down to zero, so that any exposure to radiation increases cancer risk. Or another science policy is, you know, if you can poison mice with some chemical and cause them to have an increase in cancer, we'll just assume that the same thing happens in humans. It's not science, it's an assumption. And that's what science policy is, and there's a bunch of these. So that's what my report was all about. It was all about science policy. And, you know, science policy, these assumptions, they're sort of the precautionary principle writ large. They kind of made sense maybe in the 1970s, maybe in the 1980s, because we didn't really know a lot about the effect of chemicals in the environment. Just no one had paid attention to it. We were too busy industrializing. And in the 70s and 80s, when, you know, Congress issued these laws where EPA, you know, had all this regulatory authority, there was no science to back it up. So the only way EPA could regulate was to make things up. Like, if mice get cancer, then we'll just assume that, you know, humans get cancer. If people get cancer at very high exposures, we'll just assume that any exposure will cause cancer. So back then, it was acceptable, I think, and even maybe made sense to use the science policy, all these assumptions. But of course, 50 years later, we have lots of real world experience now with radiation, chemicals, and we don't need the science policy anymore. But of course, at EPA, they still use it. The Biden administration was still using the linear no threshold model to overregulate chemicals. Okay, so, you know, since you can't make EPA staff do science unless you fire everybody and hired a bunch of, you know, kids in high school that you could teach them what science was, because I mean you can't hire kids that have graduated from you know, today's universities. They don't know anything about science either. So since you can't do that, my solution, and from the beginning in my report, the solution is just to say, just to admit what you know and what you don't know. Okay, I mean, I can understand, we don't know whether this causes cancer, but, we're worried, so we're going to regulate. I can understand it. That's acceptable. Where the problem, though, is that EPA uses these assumptions and they pretend that it's science. Okay, so they scare the bejeebers out of people when there's no scientific basis for it. Okay, is that? Okay, another thing needs to be fixed at EPA is the fraud. There's just an incredible amount of science fraud going on. My most recent book, Scare Pollution, Why and How to Fix the EPA, describes the case of particulate matter. Now, before the Clinton administration, no one thought the particulate matter in the air was a problem. Fine particulate matter, it's like soot and dust, 1/20th the width of a human hair. It's very small. If you have a walk-in closet, you should get like an air cleaner that has a PM 2.5 reader, and you'll see what I'm talking about. EPA says that one particle exposure to inhalation of one particle of dust, which is unavoidable. There's PM 2.5 floating around this room right now. Inhalation of one particle could kill you now or in 80 years. Okay, it's like a magic particle. It's the most toxic substance known to man. There's no substance on Earth as toxic as particulate matter, at least the way EPA has described it. Now, and when I'm talking about the fraud, so there was all this epidemiology, study of human population, disease in human populations that EPA had done and considered, and it had never been considered to be a problem. There was certainly no link between PM 2.5 and death. But the Clinton administration came in, and all of a sudden they said, you know what, PM 2.5 causes death. Even though their scientists, their independent scientific advisory board said, no, EPA, that's wrong. But EPA said, well, you have all this epidemiology, which was basically zero correlation stuff, but EPA converted that somehow magically into evidence that particulate matter killed. Now, EPA knew deep down, that their evidence was not evidence. So the way they tried to confirm their lousy epidemiology was by doing human experiments. And what you see here, this picture of the truck, and below is a picture of a gas chamber. This is happening at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. EPA idled the truck, piped the exhaust from the truck. I mean, they would take out the carbon monoxide, but they would pipe the exhaust into that gas chamber. And into these gas chambers, they would put elderly people, they would put asthmatics, they would put elderly asthmatics, elderly people with heart disease, kidney disease. There are experiments in Los Angeles where they would spray diesel exhaust up the noses of children as young as 10. Okay? Now, this sounds horrible, right? Because EPA says that any level of particulate matter can kill you. PM 2.5 is the most toxic substance known to man. Of course, there was not a cough or wheeze or anything that happened. Now, David Schneier, I don't know if he is here, he and I, when my group, Energy, Environment, Legal, was called American Traditions Institute, we sued EPA over these experiments. And we lost in court because the judge said, well, you guys don't have standing, which of course is the old trick to get conservatives, to end litigation by conservatives. You don't have standing. And the judge said, well, you would have to be one of the victims, one of the human guinea pigs. But of course, EPA didn't tell the victims that, the guinea pigs, that they thought PM 2.5 was the most dangerous substance known to man and these experiments might kill them. They told them that, this is just like regular air. The worst thing that can happen is maybe a cough or a wheeze. Of course, that was fraud. And then, getting the results, once again, in all the, thousands of people that underwent these experiments for money, so EPA was paying people to risk their lives, right? Not a cough or a wheeze. But none of those experimental results ever made it into an EPA rulemaking. And PM 2.5 turned out to be the most potent regulatory weapon EPA has ever had. Not only did it destroy half the coal industry in the 2010s, It was also the basis for a Clean Power Plan. You know, it's a flagship climate regulation. EPA could not calculate benefits for the Clean Power Plan. So what they did was they pretended that the Clean Power Plan, because it would reduce coal plant emissions, the emissions reduced would also include PM 2.5, and there would be, you know, so many tens of thousands of people who didn't die prematurely because there would be less exposure to PM 2.5. So that's the kind, and you know, this is sort of complex fraud, right? Most people don't get this. We forced this case to the National Academy of Sciences for them to review it, but of course they rigged the review. It was very difficult to explain this to Congress. We couldn't get Congress interested, and you know, because conservatives, Republicans, not really interested in science to start with, it was really easy for EPA to dance around it, but it was just pure fraud. I mentioned the linear non-threshold model for cancer risk assessment. This is it. And it's because of this model that we don't build, well, it's too expensive to build new nuclear reactors, and it's too expensive to permanently store nuclear waste. Now, this model was created by the National Academy of Sciences in the 1950s. It was adopted by EPA almost as soon as EPA was formed in 1970. And it's how radiation is regulated, nuclear plants or nuclear cleanup is regulated. And the graph is really pretty simple. You know, the only data we have showing that radiation causes cancer is from very high exposures, like the atomic bomb data. There are some other medical exposures where people were exposed to very high levels, and all the data shows the same thing. So we have this situation where we only have very high exposure data, and we know that they have a higher risk. But then what EPA does is just draw a line from, you know, where the exposure risk is down to 0. And then any exposure greater than 0 increases cancer risk. And of course, in EPA land, that is verboten. Okay, we can't have any of that. Now, the data, all the radiation data, the high exposure radiation data, the medical data, and the atomic bomb survivor data, okay, is very important. Even the atomic bomb survivor data show this. There's a certain amount of exposure to radiation that it doesn't increase your cancer risk. In fact, it reduces it. It's an effect called hormesis, and it's actually how vaccines work. You know, you get a low dose, and it stimulates your immune system. And it's like that with radiation and chemicals as well. And so this is what the data, this J curve, is what the scientific data show. That you go from 0 to, you know, reduced risk, and then you get to a high enough dose, and it starts going up linearly. Okay, that's what our data shows. And that's how EPA regulates now. I'm sorry, they don't regulate that. They use the linear model, even though there's no data. For what we have data, it should be the J curve, but they don't want to do that. And of course, you can kind of understand why that would be a hard sell to the public. There's a certain amount of radiation that's okay. You know, that's going to be a hard thing to sell. Even though you can demonstrate this in human populations, in populations where we know what the radiation exposures were. And you know, the nuclear industry doesn't want to talk about this. EPA doesn't want to talk about this. There are, you know, health physicists, you know, the people that are responsible for regulating or for implementing radiation rules. They'll talk about it, but nobody in the radiation regulatory mafia will talk about it. But there is a compromise solution. You could just say that from 0 to a certain level, there's no increase in risk. This is called a threshold model. And then after the certain level, you know, then the risk goes up. And if you were to use this sort of compromise, it would be a lot easier to store nuclear waste. It would be a lot easier, it would be a lot cheaper to build nuclear power plants. And you know, so once again, this is an area where the Trump administration, President Trump issued an executive order ordering the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to fix this. Of course, he should have ordered EPA to fix it because EPA is the real problem. But of course, they never ask for help, so they don't really know what to do always. Nonetheless, there's been no progress made on this. They have not moved to change this model yet in any official way. And it's really interesting because I remember reading in the Washington Post a few months ago on the front page, there were all these groups that want to invest in nuclear power. Some of them have billion-dollar valuations already. But if they don't fix this model, that's just all going away. We're not going to see more nuclear power plants. The Greens oppose this. The Greens like maximum regulatory authority. You get that from the linear no threshold model. And this applies to chemicals as well. Okay, and the third thing I want to talk about is MAHA. And I know this might not be politically correct for the Trump administration, but it's a problem. And, I thought it was a problem when they were food nannying, okay? I have a libertarian background, bent. We don't need the government telling us what to eat, mostly because the government doesn't know what it's doing itself. I mean, how much bad information have we gotten from the government? The food pyramid was nonsense. They were wrong about cholesterol, wrong about low-fat diets. They're wrong about everything, okay? Because it's not based on science. It's based on, other considerations. So we don't need government food nannying. We don't need junk science food nannying. I'm going to tie this back to climate. Don't worry. And so, some of the MAHA scares, processed foods, food additives, pesticides, microplastics, forever chemicals. Just last week, it was microplastics. Okay, you remember last year this study came out reporting that in autopsies, people were found to have 2 plastic spoons worth of microplastics in their brains. Remember that? Okay. Well, I looked at that, and you could see right away that it wasn't true. They weren't looking at microplastic. They were looking at something else, because they had brains of like a 5-year-old and a 75-year-old. And the theory is that microplastics accumulate in your brains over time. But the 5-year-old and the 75-year-old had the same amount of microplastic in their brain, so which is not physically possible, per that theory. So they were literally just, making it up. They weren't looking, and as it turns out, fat produces false positives for plastic. So, and the brain is 60% fat. But none of this made any of the news coverage. And last week, RFK Jr. and even Administrator Zeldin, unfortunately, announced this program of microplastics. And, and because they're being pressured by MAHA. They're being pressured by MAHA, MAHA activists to get rid of pesticides. They focused on glyphosate, Roundup. We get rid of Roundup, our food supply is going to be in danger. They want to get rid of food additives. I know people are scared about food additives, but it's really unnecessary. And if we get rid of, processed foods, they call them ultra-processed foods, and food additives and pesticides, our food supply is going to be in a world of hurt. Okay, and it's going to hurt poor people the most. And I think that MAHA is actually a left-wing op, which should not surprise anybody, because RFK Jr., he's a left-winger. Okay, I know that Trump likes him, but he's a left-winger. Is Mark Morano here? Mark Morano did a bang-up interview of RFK Jr. in like 2014, where he says that he's for jailing CEOs and punishing climate skeptics. His sentence was 3 hots and a cot in The Hague with the other war criminals. That's you guys, me. Maybe not Jason Isaac, but okay. These guys, MAHA, they tried to get Zeldin fired because Zeldin would not, get rid of glyphosate. And there's some other pesticides at issue. They went after him. Now, what kind of Republicans go after a Republican administrator? It's crazy. And so they have him, they kind of have him, and I guess maybe to throw a bone to them, he signed up for the microplastic scare, okay? And it's crazy. We need to get rid of these people. These people are, and it's only a matter of time before they become interested in climate. The microplastics scare is actually a climate op, right? It's another way to get to the fossil fuel industry, to get to the oil and gas industry, because that's where plastic comes from, right? The petrochemical industry. So, I think I saw there's an op-ed in the Hill today by some MAHA activists and a Democrat congressman, okay? This is a Democrat op. It's junk science fueled. They're going to turn on Trump because he's not going to do things fast enough. Pesticides. This is a major problem. The op-ed in the Hill today is about glyphosate. Okay, we need glyphosate. It's safe. It's inert. Microplastics, safe and inert. Your body just, microplastics are everywhere in the air. We inhale them. We ingest them. They're in the air, food and water, everywhere. But they're inert. Okay, that's why plastic is so useful, right? Plastic it's inert, and our body excretes them. Okay, and the same with PFAS, forever chemicals. They're so useful. We've been using them for 80 years. They're so useful because they're inert. You can store stuff in them. They provide frictionless, have frictionless properties, and but it's something that MAHA is after, and it's going to get to climate. I'm surprised it didn't stop. I guess getting MAHA involved in climate is perhaps a leap too far now, but they will come back. They will get around to it, or they will get around. They will succeed with microplastics, or they're going to cause problems. They are not science-based, and science is what I care about. It is very disheartening to me. I've been in the conservative movement since 1990, and I've worked on science, obviously. And conservatives were always very level-headed people. People on my side always very level-headed. They understood what risk assessment was. If you could explain it to them, they could understand what it's all about. They could understand the flaws of the EPA. Everybody was for regulatory reform. But now all of a sudden with MAHA, this has changed. And we've got all these people that are worried about everything in the environment. They used to be confined to the Democrat Party and to radical environmental groups. Now it's a feature of the Trump administration. So, so that's my presentation. And so these are the things I'm worried about. I'm worried about the endangerment finding. We got to finish that. And even if we do get Massachusetts versus EPA overturned, the left is not going away. Just so you know, on climate, we may be winning now, but the long term, the left is not going away on any of this. They're going to come back. They have had far too much success with it to walk away. Is Al Gore going to walk away from this? No. I just don't see that happening. And we need to fix the science. We at least need to get to the point where we can explain what the science, what the limitations of EPA risk decisions are, the uncertainties, and then we need to get rid of MAHA. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.